Before we dive into our topic today, I have to read this disclaimer. The opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Correct. Good. Okay. And which of Napoleon's fine officers are we discussing today?
We are discussing Jean-Baptiste Kléber.
Yeah, he's a guy I don't think gets enough notoriety. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree for a number of reasons, but we can get into all that.
Okay. Well, let's dive right in. Jean-Baptiste Kléber was born in March 1753 in Strasbourg in the Alsace region. What do we know about his early life?
So he has a really interesting and diverse background in early life. So he's born into a family where his father is a stonemason, and his mother comes from a very wealthy family. And what's interesting is his father is a Catholic and his mother's a Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't uncommon given the religious tolerance of Alsace at the time, and it makes sense given its geographic location. But unfortunately for Kleber, his father passed away when he was just a few months old. And it's a tragic event that really significantly impacts his upbringing, although his mother does remarry about 2 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And from a young age, Kleber, he's known for his vivacity and sometimes turbulent nature. And his stepfather wasn't really a fan of Kleber, aside
Mm-hmm.
from being a stepson, wasn't well behaved. So his stepfather, he sends him off to live with his grandparents and also under the protection of the Cardinal de Rohan. And granted, to be fair to his stepfather, the stepfather was correct in his assessment. Kleber was known to get into fights, and he wasn't very well behaved. Quite an
Mm-hmm.
energetic youth. And so his education, it's early on, it's marked by a strong influence of philosophy and religion. And he immediately displays a natural talent for drawing. He excels in his studies, particularly in the exact science and architecture. And his education really takes a pivotal turn and elevates when Cardinal de Rohan recognizes Kleber's potential and takes greater interest in him. And the cardinal encourages him to pursue architecture studies, first in Munster, and then later in Paris under the tutelage of the esteemed architect Chalgrin. And this is really where Kleber hones his architectural knowledge and builds a foundation and a skill set that actually proves invaluable later on for his military engineering skill set.
Okay.
So in summary, his early life is really an interesting mix of influence and experiences, from the loss of his father to the kind of nurturing guidance of the Cardinal de Rohan. And each element, I think, plays a crucial role in shaping the man who would become a legendary, at least in some circles, military leader.
Right. And it's not an aristocratic upbringing, but he does get a good education.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay. So moving forward now in his teens, early 20s, he serves briefly in the French Royal Army. And then, interestingly enough, he gains a commission in the Austrian Army. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, briefly on that point, just because it's important and it comes into play later. So as a youth, he's drawn increasingly to a military career. There's a couple instances where he's talking to Austrian officers and they're telling him about the awesome uniform and all the great reasons to serve. And so in 1776, at the recommendation of Prince Konitz, he enters the Austrian army as a cadet in that regiment where Konitz is the colonel. And this regiment, pretty prestigious. It's part of the Belgian National Infantry and it's stationed at Mons. But despite the regiment's prestigious position, Kleber's early service did not really offer many opportunities for distinction. Now, he does advance to the rank of ensign within 8 weeks, second lieutenant about 6 months later. But this period of time in Europe, and especially for Kleber, it's largely uneventful due to really any active military engagements or campaigns, unless you want to count the Potato War. So the regiment and Kleber sees garrison duty in various locations, but all this leads to Kleber's frustration with the slow pace of promotion, which was often really influenced by noble birth rather than merit during this time frame.
Mm-hmm.
So Disillusioned with the lack of advancement opportunities, Kleber resigns from the regiment in 1783 and returns to Strasbourg.
So about 7 years, and he returns to civilian life. What does he do as a civilian?
So, as a civilian, he comes back. He comes back to Strasbourg, penniless, and even though he's left, his former colonel writes him promising to make him a captain of a grenadier company, but he refuses. It would have been a relatively prestigious position. At the time, grenadiers were kind of the elite troops as opposed to regular line infantry. But he refuses, and it's probably for the best, just because Kleber had a pretty bad temper and wasn't really getting along in the Austrian army. It also helped that his mother really isn't the biggest fan of his military service,
Right.
particularly abroad. Today, especially in the American army, there's a lot of honor and prestige that goes along with serving. Wasn't the case at the time, especially when it came to foreigners serving abroad.
Hmm.
So his mother uses her connections to get him a job as a public building inspector. And so, relatively modest job, but not really a difficult one. And so his job didn't take up all of his time. So he also works as an architect. And it makes sense given his architectural background. He builds a town hall, some chateaus, but he particularly enjoys building gardens.
Yeah,
Um,
let's dive into that. We're not talking about
yeah,
like my vegetable garden in the backyard. This is like Versailles, like big gardens, right?
big gardens, right? In Versailles, that's what's known as a French garden, right? Um, Formal, symmetric, control over nature, geometric patterns.
Right.
But those were going out of style at the time. So English gardens were coming into style. And those are known kind of for their natural appearance and formal layout, incorporation of varied plantings and landscape features. And a lot of times, we have these big landscape portraits and paintings. Those are actually paintings of what we would call English gardens. And so that's what he particularly enjoys building. One of the ones he builds is really extravagant. It has a Turkish kiosk with a minaret, a fisherman's hut, a wine grower's house, Greek-style temples, a Gothic knight's tomb. It even has an aviary for swans. So for any art buffs, without going too far down that rabbit hole, he's a neoclassical architect and very much participate and thrives in that style.
Okay. But after a few notable achievements architecturally, including a town hall, and you mentioned gardens and chateaus that remain today, Kleber joins the army again in 1792. And I just had trying to figure it out. Did he get swept up in the revolutionary fervor, or did he see that officers were being promoted on merit instead of birthright?
So, fun fact, he'd actually been in the Belfort National Guard since July 1789. But as to your question, I think the answer is both, and I don't think you can really separate the two given his past.
Mm-hmm.
So when the revolution breaks out in 1789, he immediately declares himself a friend of liberty, a supporter of the movement. And by 1792, the revolutionary fervor sweeping through France is even more intense. And it had created an atmosphere of intense patriotism and a call to arms to defend the newly established republic, because Europe wasn't very happy about it. And so Kleber, like many others, felt the pull of these revolutionary ideals. I should note that while he was sincerely attached to the new ideas in the revolution, he also disdained a lot of the public demonstrations that involved violence. So I would cast him as a supporter of the revolution, but not
But
necessarily a full-blown radical.
not a reign of terror guy.
Not a reign of terror guy. I think you
Yeah.
can safely call him a moderate, or you'd also just call him a Republican.
Mm.
Um, but I think another crucial element is the prospect of merit-based promotions. The revolution had dismantled many of the old aristocratic privileges, including in the military, where promotions had traditionally been based on birthright rather than ability. And for someone like Kleber, who had previously been frustrated by the lack of promotion and advancement opportunities, this was a significant change. So his return to military service in 92 was really motivated by both personal ambition and a genuine sense of patriotism. I
Well,
should note, however, that his financial troubles also played a role. in his return to military life. He didn't have a lot of money. He was never good at managing it, and his debts were accumulating. So,
Well, he must have had some natural skill because he's promoted to brigadier general in 1793. So maybe that early experience in the Austrian army, or perhaps he was just a good leader of men, like people wanted to follow him.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How did he do? How did he perform in the early part of his career?
So early on, generally good for the
Mhm.
most part, but there are a few missteps. But most importantly for Kleber, he manages to avoid execution despite some of those mistakes.
Mhm.
So after Mainz, Kleber is arrested and brought before the National Convention. Of course, the defense of Mainz was not successful,
Right.
but Kleber, he's acquitted of any wrongdoing, and he's promoted in August 1793. And since he was part of that surrendering force at Mainz, he couldn't fight the Allies again for a year. All
Mhm.
the soldiers who surrendered, part of that surrender agreement was they couldn't fight the Allies for a year. So he's sent to Western France to deal with the little revolt that is going on.
So he's put on parole where he can't fight enemy armies, but he can still contribute by suppressing revolts internally. Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
So right now there's the revolt in the Vendée, which is getting pretty intense. And for
Mhm.
context, on 1 August, the convention had issued a decree of extermination, I think you could call it, against the rebels.
Mhm.
They proclaimed the forest will be cut down, the hideouts of the brigands will be destroyed, the crops will be harvested, the livestock will be seized, and everything will be transported out of the country. So
Wow.
Kleber rejoins the army on 22 August to do just that.
Mhm. And his performance, I would say, as most of the generals in putting down the Vendée revolt, was mixed. Correct.
It was definitely mixed. So his first action is at Torfu, and I won't get into all the maneuvers that lead up. But on 19 September, his forces reached the town, which is being held by rebels, and there are two roads leading to the village. And so Kleber, he splits up his forces to encircle it, and he deploys his infantry in a two-prong attack, kind of on the heights surrounding Torfu, and it's supported by artillery. Pretty good plan. Um, the rebels initially flee, but they're motivated by the presence of their families among them. There's a couple of famous paintings of the battle where you see the women of the village shoving their men back into the line. And so the rebels fiercely resist. And despite that initial success of capturing the heights, Kleber's forces were counterattacked and forced to retreat due to superior enemy numbers.
Right.
And despite this counterattack and being pretty seriously wounded by being shot in the shoulder, he maintains command and successfully withdraws.
But he has to write a letter, not apologizing, but kind of spin doctoring the loss. Correct.
Yeah, that being said, this is 100% defeat.
Yep.
Uh, and he writes a number of letters, and it's in Kleber's best interest to really spin things in his favor if he wants to keep his head. So in one letter, he claims to have had everything under control. But the problem was his troops panicked. It wasn't his fault.
Of
He
course.
writes, Torfu and all the heights were mine, despite the tenacity the enemy put into attacking them, and it was only due to a panic terror that I lost all these advantages. And then, in an effort to do more damage control, he also writes a very long letter to his commanding officer, which included, I await your justice, General, that you will kindly have my letter printed so that those who might have conceived of some unfavorable idea about my way of doing in this day may be disillusioned. Any general can be beaten, and there may be no fault of his own.
Mm.
But most importantly, he was smart enough to have a good relationship with the representatives on mission,
Mm-hmm.
who quite liked him. So rather than be executed, he kept his command.
And these are political commissars sent out by the central government to make sure that the generals were zealous enough and active enough for command.
Correct.
Yeah.
Zealous enough, active enough, made sure they were successful. Of course, the general was quote unquote in charge, but everything they did really needed to be approved by them.
Mm. Yeah. Interesting.
So, in
So,
fact, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
And so he's, in fact, so highly regarded that on 7 October, he is appointed to acting general and chief of the army after a number of the other senior officers are recalled.
Mm.
And he fights in a number of small actions following Torfu that he wins. But his next major battle is really at Cholet on 17 October.
Right.
And I won't get into all the maneuvers here, but it's mostly a straight up fight that is brutal. It goes back and forth. And during the battle, Kleber, he leads from the front. And in the end, he's victorious, but only after there are over 10,000 casualties on both sides.
Oh.
And a lot of the fighting itself is within the town. It's street-to-street fighting, and it's very destructive. And Kleber, he's pretty torn up after the battle. He wrote, "I lost on this day, and of that of the 15th, for my division alone, 14 brigade chiefs, battalion chiefs, or officers of my staff, all my friends and comrades in arms from Mainz."
Mm.
And after the battle, after this victory, he's promoted to general of division, or major general on our terms.
Right.
Moreover, after this battle, it's such a big victory, the Republicans think the war is won. But much of their surprise, the rebels had escaped north towards Normandy.
Mm.
So fighting continues through October and November. Kleber wins some, he loses some, but everything really culminates in December. And so on 13 December, you have the Battle of Le Mans. By this point, the rebels, they're weak. They're dealing with disease, desertion, lack of supplies. So they're seeking refuge in the town. But Kleber and Marceau, they smash the rebels there. Some of them flee. Then 9 days later, Kleber catches up to the rebels at Savigny. He positions his troops to encircle the town, assaults at dawn, and the rebels are just overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And while the battle didn't mark the end of the war, it certainly marked the end of this campaign.
Okay.
And interesting, following the battle, he kind of takes a risk of expressing that Vendéens merited some lenient measures.
Mm.
He wrote, "From this, it is clear that this war will not end without wisely combined extensive measures. It would not be with means of fire that we should resort, because the sight of villages in ashes could only add to the bitterness of already agitated spirits." And so what he's doing here, it's like he's admitting that, yes, there needs to be a military aspect of it, but it shouldn't be too harsh, right? So there's kind of a modern hearts and mind aspect to his train of thought.
Right.
So as a result of these sentiments, he is recalled once again by the authorities, but luckily for him, nothing really comes of it. So he's reinstated in April of 1794, and then he's sent off to the Army of the Ardennes, and he serves in the Rhineland for the next couple of years. But I think that's a topic for another episode. But on an interesting note, between 1795 and 96, he holds chief command of the army on an interim basis on a number of times, but he, time and time again, he declines a permanent appointment to any sort of senior position.
Yeah,
so
that's a wise move.
Probably, but that's kind of a trend with his career. Like, he's always quick to criticize his boss. He'll temporarily take command of the army, but then he refuses to be the boss. But on the whole, he had a pretty solid performance in his first few years, although there are some missteps.
Okay. So as you mentioned, he is moved to other fronts and serves under the future Marshal Jourdan in 1796. He wins the Battle of Siegburg against the Austrians not long after. And that must have felt pretty good for Kleber to defeat his former army who didn't think he was worthy of a promotion. Don't you think?
It certainly must have. The battle also enabled the French army to move across the Rhine and continue that campaign. Granted, we should note that he had been fighting and sometimes winning against the Austrians for about 2 years at that point. The Battle of Floors in 1794 is probably the best example. And of course, 3 days after Seeburg, he wins an arguably more significant battle at Alterkirchen, where he commands 3 future marshals. Now, aside from his victories, I find his behavior during the campaign interesting. Once again, there are several occasions where he's offered positions and then refuses or resigns due to health reasons. His final resignation is on 28 November and it isn't initially accepted by the Minister of War. He writes him, "It is with much regret that I see you have decided to resign and leave the army at a time when it needs your wisdom and experience the most. I like to believe that by reflecting further on this matter, your love for public service will outweigh some inconveniences you complain about." Now, Kleber, he isn't dissuaded, and in the following months, he writes a number of very melodramatic letters regarding his health. One line is, "My greatest desire would be to continue my career in the military, but my poor health, doesn't let me." So eventually, he's allowed to resign and retire, but that doesn't last long, so he must have had some really good doctors.
Well, I'm trying to wrap my head around what kind of guy he was. He sounds like he's talented, but also sounds like he's a bit of a complainer, like he's quick to criticize others.
He is quick to criticize. A lot of the letters that I'm writing, like he's writing to other people complaining about his commanding officer. He's complaining to the commanding officer, and oftentimes he's recommending one plan or another, one course of action or another. And when they don't do it, he isn't very happy about it. But at the same time, he could be in a position to be making those decisions, and he refuses that position.
Yeah.
So definitely an interesting character.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, yeah, and maybe he did. Maybe his ideas were the better way to go, but he didn't want to be, I guess, he didn't want to be where the buck stops here guy. He didn't want to be that guy. He wanted to be the second in command or something like that.
I definitely get that impression.
Yeah.
I do not want to be the historian that tries to psychoanalyze the generals, but I definitely think he wanted to avoid overall command and responsibility for whatever reason.
Well, he's going to get it here shortly. After turning down promotion as commander-in-chief, as we discussed, he briefly goes in retirement, but is brought back to service for the 1798 invasion of Egypt led by up-and-comer Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon must have heard about Kleber's abilities. Just to give some background, what are the goals of this Egyptian invasion by Napoleon and the French army?
So the Egyptian campaign, ultimately, it was an attempt to strike at the British. They saw it as a way to establish a base from which they would potentially advance on India. At the time, the British are fighting off and on with Tipu Sultan of Mysore in India, who was very friendly with the French. The French even had military advisors with them. So the plan was to occupy and fortify Egypt, and then send a force of about 15,000 men from Suez to India, link up with the Tipu Sultan, and then drive away the English. Personally, I think this plan was ambitious to say the least, but the plan was there.
Yeah.
But there's also other factors. They were going to turn Egypt into a breadbasket because going back, right, they had lost Canada during the 7 Years' War. They want to get that breadbasket back. Egypt is a good way to do it. There's also this really wild idea of building a canal through Egypt, but I don't know, that's kind of craziness. More than that, the Directory, they also buy into this plan because it allows them to get rid of Napoleon, right?
Yeah.
He'd made quite a name for himself in Italy, due no small part to his own self-promotion in newspapers. And Egypt it's a long way from France.
Yeah. And they want to the government wants to get the most popular man in France out of France so he doesn't take over the government. I totally get that. And Napoleon, too, he's read up on the classics. He knows Caesar was there and Alexander the Great was there. So I think seeing himself in that vein, he wants to see what Egypt is all about.
And there's a lot of potential that if the Egyptian campaign is successful, it puts a lot of pressure on the British, and maybe they'll stop. They'll just let France be.
Yeah. Well, Kleber receives command of a division in Napoleon's Egyptian army, but he suffers a head wound early on in the skirmish during the Battle of Alexandria. And due to the injury, doesn't initially travel to Cairo and misses the famous Battle of the Pyramids. How does the early part of the campaign go?
Getting to Mount Tabor.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. So, although he's not involved, he is involved in the Syrian campaign of 1799, where Kleber wins a great victory at Mount Tabor. What kind of happens here? What is significant about this battle?
Well, barely wins a great victory. So for context, we're in April of 1799, right? Napoleon, he's been besieging Acre for about a month, but he knows there's a large Ottoman force in the field. So Napoleon, being Napoleon, he sends out separate detachments to find, fix, and engage the Ottomans before they can consolidate themselves and attack him, defeat the enemy in detail. And Napoleon's largely successful in the days leading up to the Battle of Mount Tabor. And there's a number of engagements where the French are successful and they defeat the Ottomans, but there's still a significant Ottoman force out in the field. And so Kleber, he's part of one of these detachments that's trying to find the enemy. And so he finds himself in Nazareth on 15 April, and he receives intelligence that there's a large Ottoman force encamped to the south of Mount Tabor. And he immediately begins preparations to march, and he informs Napoleon of his decision, although he doesn't ask permission. Now, Kleber, sometimes he gets flack for this, saying that, he was going, he was a hard charger, he was tired of Napoleon, and he was just going to go attack the enemy without any sort of preparations, right?
And he didn't have a large force, right? It was a detachment, like you said. It's small.
Yeah, it wasn't a large force, right? But he sometimes gets flack for his decision, but this decision was within the realm of his orders. He was carrying out Napoleon's intent. Because the day before, on 14 April, Berthier, who gave all of Napoleon's orders, wrote to Kleber that if the enemy dared to make camp near your camp, the general has no doubt you would make an attack on him, which would have the same great success of our reach. And after Napoleon learns of Kleber's plan, because Kleber did inform him, he responds via Berthier that the general-in-chief instructs me to tell you that it is very necessary that you do not lose sight of the enemy in order to take advantage of all favorable opportunities to attack him. Right? So he's operating within the realm of Napoleon's intent, and he's executing it. And after that, there's more correspondence going back and forth, coordinating movements or reinforcements that I won't get into. But the point I'm trying to make is that Kleber is often seen as going into this battle half-cocked without coordinating, when in reality he's actually seizing the initiative, although the execution leaves something to be desired.
Okay.
So back to the battle. The Ottomans are about 6 miles to the southeast of Nazareth, and rather than march directly at them, Kleber's plan is to march around Mount Tabor, which is to the east, and approach the Ottomans from the rear, which is about from a northeasterly direction, and a surprise attack. And the goal is to attack them about an hour before sunrise. The problem is that his route is around 16 miles long, and normally this is a relatively short distance, especially for the French army, but the French, they're moving at night, and they're relying on a local guide at unfamiliar terrain, and they kind of get lost. So Kleber starts his march around 10 p.m., but he doesn't arrive until 6 a.m., which is well after sunrise. Now, initially, the attack goes well, and the Ottomans are taken by surprise. But there are a number of significant issues here. The 1,500 French, they're in a plain, and they're in 2 large squares. But they're surrounded by about 35,000 Ottomans who hold the high ground.
That's a big ratio difference right there.
Yeah, just a little bit, right? In their defense, you have the Battle of the Pyramids and various other engagements where they're outnumbered and they do well. But this is a big ask, and the fighting lasts through the morning. The 2 squares become separated, but they're able to link back up around noon. But the French, they're exhausted, right? They've been fighting for 6 hours in the heat. After a forced march, they're hungry and they're running out of ammo. One soldier at the battle stated that we would have given what little bread we had. We would have traded it for some powder and bullets because we just didn't have time to eat the bread. And even if we had the time, we could hardly enjoy it because we were so parched with thirst and fatigue that we could no longer speak. Add to that the exposure to the blazing sun and continually having gunpowder and smoke of weapons in our mouths. And you have to realize, like, you're thirsty, your mouth is dry, and then there's constantly this acrid gunpowder making your mouth even drier.
Yeah.
So they're not having a good time. So now Kleber, he's getting desperate.
Time's running out. Yeah.
time's running out. He's getting ready to stage a breakout. Initially, one of the plans floated was to kind of hold out until nightfall and then try to get away, but that's just not going to happen. So he's getting ready to stage a breakout, but just in the nick of time, Napoleon arrives on the battlefield, announcing his presence with cannon fire. Napoleon forms his force to 3 squares to advance on the Ottomans, and Napoleon positions himself between the Ottomans and their camp. Right,
Mm-hmm.
so the Ottomans they're trying to grapple with this newly arrived French force. They feel like they're cut off from their camp, and so Kleber he seizes the moment and orders a charge, and this turns into an Ottoman rout. And so because Kleber had coordinated with Napoleon, let him know, he's able to pull out a victory. So to wrap this up, what's significant about this battle, aside from the victory itself, it enabled the continued siege of Acre, although Napoleon ultimately fails to capture it. But that's a topic for another podcast. And so while Kleber, he does make some mistakes, he certainly doesn't deserve the amount of negative treatment that he sometimes gets for this battle.
Okay. So as you mentioned, Napoleon's Syrian campaign has to... Well, it fails because they can't capture Acre, so he has to return to Cairo. And Napoleon, realizing his chances of further conquest are very limited, he has a small, isolated army. His navy's been destroyed by the British Navy and Nelson. Napoleon returns to France without consulting Kleber and leaves him in charge of the French army in Egypt. Can you kind of walk us through this? Because this is very unusual even for Napoleon. What was Kleber's reaction to this news?
His reaction is that bugger has deserted us with his breeches full of crap. When we get back to Europe, we'll rub his face in it. So not well.
Yeah.
But granted, had I been left in that position, I would not have been very happy either.
Yeah.
And Kleber learns of his appointment, this new lofty position, from a letter from Napoleon, who had been on his way home for a few days. Granted, he didn't have the best relationship with Napoleon prior to this, but being left to clean this mess up certainly didn't help. They regularly went back and forth, but I think this is kind of a bridge too far.
Well, it's interesting. He took some generals with him. He took Lannes, Berthier, Murat. He took some Marmont. He took some of his favorites with him, but he left Kleber behind.
He left them behind, and so maybe that was intentional. So so Kleber he's in this situation. He writes to the Directory that General Bonaparte left absolutely nothing in the army's coffer aside from 10 million francs in debts. And Kleber notes that this is more than a year's worth of tax revenue. In addition to these 10 million francs in debt, the army is also due back pay of 4 million francs. And so what little army you have left hasn't been paid. And to top it all off, he can't even start collecting taxes again until late November because of the Nile's annual flooding. He also writes that the army is dressed in rags, is sick, is short of munitions. So in short, Kleber doesn't have a lot going for him. And it's a great letter. There's a long list of other complaints. But unfortunately for Kleber, it's intercepted by the British, who then publish it. Not only that, by the time all of this gets back to Paris, Napoleon's now in charge, rather than the old government. Now, Napoleon, upon receiving this news, he decides a proclamation is in order. And here's his proclamation. Soldiers, the consuls of the French Republic frequently direct their attention to the army of the East. France acknowledges all the influence of your conquests on the restoration of her trade and the civilization of the world. The eyes of all of Europe are upon you, and I am often with you in thought. In whatever situation the chances war may place you, prove yourselves still the soldiers of Rivoli and Aboukir. You will be invincible. Place in Kleber the boundless confidence which you reposed in me. He deserves it. Soldiers, think of the day you will return victorious to the sacred territory of France. That will be a glorious day for the whole nation. So Napoleon is saying, hey, we're still thinking of you guys. You guys got this. We believe in you. But unfortunately for the French stranded in Egypt, this proclamation didn't do much to better the whole situation.
Right. It's kind of paying lip service to their horrible situation.
I would agree with that, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Kleber is kind of running out of options. Like you said, he's the army's in arrears with pay. He's surrounded by a British blockade. So, seeing the futility of his army's situation, he begins peace negotiations with the British. And these have a lot of drama in them. How did these negotiations go?
Yeah, so for some context, like you said, things are really not looking good for Kleber and the French. So in the Mediterranean, in addition to the British fleet, a Russian squadron under Admiral Ushakov has joined the fleet. So there's absolutely no way they're getting out there. And then in Syria, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire has assembled a huge army to attack Egypt by land. He's also gathered up a lot of the Mamelukes who had previously fled into this army. And there's also a partisan war going on against the French in Upper Egypt. So Kleber's enemies are pressing in on all sides, and so he rightfully wants to come to an agreement to leave Egypt. Now, for the negotiates themselves, there's back and forth, but they go pretty well. They get to the end goal, and the Convention of El Arish, it's signed on 24 January by the French and the Ottomans. But now here's the key.
Mm-hmm.
It is in the presence of a British representative. It is not signed by the British. So the British Commodore, Sidney Smith, he goes along with it. There's tacit agreement, but he doesn't sign it himself. One of his representatives doesn't sign it, and that leaves a nice loophole for later.
Right.
And so as part of the agreement, the French, they're going to leave Egypt within 3 months with very particular timelines, and they begin preparations to do so. And so they start withdrawing from forts and consolidating. So after the convention,
honorable evacuation. Yeah.
Honorable evacuation, protected evacuation. They get to go back to France with all of their arms and prisoners. But after this convention is signed and all this is going on, Commodore Smith, he receives orders from London that have been dated 15 September. Or really, Lord Keith, who is commanding the British fleet in the Med, receives it and gives it to Smith. And the orders state that the British would not support any unilateral treaties between the Ottomans and the French, and to not, and I am quoting this, consent to any capitulation with the French troops at least unless they lay down their arms, surrender themselves as prisoners of war, and deliver all the ships and stores of the port of Alexandria to the Allied powers. So this is pretty much an unconditional surrender. So after this, Smith informs Kleber of this, and naturally, Kleber is outraged. Now, to be fair to Smith, he didn't have to warn Kleber, so hats off to him. But after receiving the warning, Kleber proposed to the Ottomans to withdraw their army from Cairo and delay the convention until Admiral Keith would authorize a free evacuation. The Ottomans not having this, and they demanded Cairo be handed over within 8 days, and this was unacceptable to Kleber, as it would pretty much place the French army in the desert, reliant on Ottoman goodwill for supplies.
Right.
So Kleber, he keeps negotiating with the Ottomans to buy time, but he's also urgently and very quickly preparing to resume hostilities. He recalls all of his heavy artillery to rearm the Cairo forts, consolidates his forces, pulls his forces from Upper Egypt. On 18 March, he informed his soldiers of Keith's letter, declaring, "Soldiers, we will respond to this insolent letter with victories. Prepare to fight." So his words, they electrify the army. They're furious at the English for shattering the hopes of a quick return.
Sure.
And the soldiers are pumped for battle. And I will tell you from personal experience, nothing makes a soldier angrier than having their deployment extended. Just in this case, they could be mad at the enemy and the perfidious British rather than their own commander.
Right. And I know they take it out on the Ottomans at the Battle of Héliopolis. What happens in that one?
So at this time, Kleber has done his best to prepare for the battle. He knows he has to go on the offensive against the Ottomans, and so Kleber has around 10,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 to 50 cannon. That number is kind of murky. The Ottomans, they have at least 60,000, although some estimates are much higher. So on 20 March, he leads the French army out against the Ottomans. And the night before the battle, he positioned his troops on the plain north of Cairo. So they're well positioned and they're ready to go. And luckily for the French, they were able to get enough munitions, with each NCO and soldier having about 60 cartridges. And so at dawn, the French vanguard encountered the Turkish vanguard in a garrison village. Kleber ordered an attack, but as the assault began, the Ottoman commander of the vanguard requested a parley. And Kleber, who, quote, had only broken the evacuation against his will, wanted to try another means of accommodation, but the attack was already underway. So village is captured along with some artillery, and the French don't take many casualties. As the French advanced, the main Ottoman army under the Grand Vizier appeared. And the main action of this battle happens along the French right flank, but the French, as they often do in Egypt, they form squares. And predictably, it doesn't go well from the Ottomans. And I'll quote Lieutenant Colonel Richardot here, since he was at the battle and I wasn't. At this moment, a battery placed in the center of the line opened a very lively fire on our squares, but our artillery of the second and third square quickly placed itself in front, and a few hasty discharges instantly threw this battery into disorder. The French infantry, they held firm, and charge after charge is just put down. And so the Ottoman forces, they're routed. The Grand Vizier retreats. The French, they pretty much burn all of their artillery stores. One officer observed they fired over 5,000 rounds. And the French then, they pursue the retreating enemy. And Kleber refuses the Grand Vizier's request for any sort of ceasefire, because remember before this, he was like, hey, we should put all the fighting off until we can get out. And then the Ottomans told him, nope, we want Cairo. So now the tables flipped.
What a frustrating time, though, for all parties. Like, the Ottomans can't beat the French. They can't get them out of there. The French want to go home, but the British won't let them. And the French don't trust the British on their peace agreement. So it must have been for all parties just very frustrating.
Very frustrating, confusing, probably some needless fighting. But, what we see here, what we see throughout the Napoleonic Wars, but obviously here is kind of the problems with coalition warfare. It's like, yes, you have their allies, but each party, each state, they have their own priorities. And the priorities of the Ottomans, a lot of times they don't align with the British, and I mean, that goes across the board.
Yeah. Let's discuss Kleber's unfortunate assassination. The citizens of Cairo had revolted a few times against
Real quick, we can edit this out, but I mean, I have some more stuff about kind of why this battle really isn't celebrated.
Do it. Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, so I mean, yeah, we're good. So ultimately, the battle, like, it's decisive victory for Kleber and the French. The Ottoman army, like I said, over 60,000 was defeated. And there's an entire spring campaign, and the French losses are pretty low. They only lose about 700 men across 3 different battles and a month-long siege at Cairo, because they have to go back Cairo and siege and capture it again, with about 100-to-1 casualty ratio. And so the victory, it secures French control of Egypt temporarily, but Kleber never really gets much glory for this victory. For context, Napoleon had won the Battle of Marengo against the Austrians on 14 June. And so the account of Marengo appears in the official press on 22 June, almost immediately. On the other hand, there are some minor accounts of Héliopolis that are reported in Paris, but they're not necessarily believed because they're all secondhand. They're coming through different countries. And the full account of the battle isn't reported on until 29 June. But by then, the focus is fully on Napoleon. And Kleber is once again overshadowed. And this continues years later. Napoleon later writes that the Battle of Héliopolis was not fought. The Grand Vizier's army offered no resistance. The Prime Minister himself had no military experience. His army was not worth that of Mount Tabor. So Napoleon really continues to downplay this victory years after the fact, and of course Kleber isn't alive to advocate for himself.
Yeah, Napoleon's not one to share glory usually. So it makes sense.
Not at all.
Well, I do want to discuss the untimely demise of Kleber not long afterwards. The citizens of Cairo had revolted a few times against the French occupying army and were brutally suppressed.
Yes.
Was Kleber's assassination related to that? And what happened here? What happened to his assassin?
So it was, of course, accounts vary. I've also read claims that you know aren't fully supported that two Ottoman intelligence officers orchestrated the killing. But needless to say, there's a lot of different parties that were not very happy with the French and Kleber. So on that fateful day, Kleber was stabbed to death by a young Syrian student named Suleiman al-Habibi, and excuse me, al-Halabi. And al-Halabi had disguised himself as a beggar seeking charity or an audience to get close. Once again, the accounts differ. But once he got close, he stabbed Kleber multiple times, of course, leading to his death. And the assassin was captured a few days later. And then he was put on trial, and then he was executed with a pike hammered up his rectum. So not the best way to go.
Mm.
His body, the dagger, and everything else, they're all taken back to France, and his body and the dagger remain there until this day. And they were often put on exhibitions in museums, although in recent years there's been some repatriation movements.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate too because I know the next successive commander, Minot, was not as talented as Kleber, and eventually the French do have to surrender to the British and leave Egypt.
Yeah, yes, although I'm not sure if Kleber, despite all of his talents, would have been able to rescue that situation with how cut off they were and isolated.
Well, yeah, and let's talk about that. I mean, I always like this. My final question is always, what do you think his legacy is? I read he's credited with bringing Freemasonry to Egypt. And I know Napoleon was a big fan of his, saying, "quote No sight so splendid as watching Kleber go into battle." End quote. Do you think he would have become a Marshal of France if he had successfully returned from Egypt?
Yeah, he said he was like the god of war of Mars, excuse me, like the god of war Mars in uniform. As to the question about Marshall, I'll answer that with a confident I'm not sure, but probably. There's always the what ifs of history. There's certainly reports of Napoleon speaking highly of him, but there's also evidence that Napoleon felt threatened by him. For example, after the assassination, Kleber's remains are returned to France in 1801, and then the body is placed in quarantine for a number of years, and Kleber isn't formally buried until Napoleon is exiled.
Mm.
I think Kleber's skill could have warranted an appointment, but Napoleon also might have been threatened by his political leanings. At the same time, Napoleon appointed some of his marshals for political reasons. So if I had to bet one way or another, I'd say he does become a marshal, although probably closer to a nay or than a debut.
Yeah.
Uh, as far as legacy, I mean, I think it's largely positive and slightly diverse. I mean, you have his architectural achievements, opening the Masonic Temple in Cairo. But most importantly for me, and I am biased, being as a military historian, I think his military accomplishments speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, his legacy is certainly overshadowed by the marshals, especially in the English-speaking historical community. There is not an extensive biography on him in English, but I think in the coming years that will change. And I certainly hope that historians, hopefully Dr. Jordan Hayworth, who I must thank for all of his help over the years, will write one. But I think as historians continue to write kind of about the Revolutionary Wars, the Forced Coalition, and the kind of secondary generals, I think his legacy will grow over time.
Yeah, you wonder because as far as the Marshal question, he could promote like Bernadotte was somewhat of a rival, and he promoted him to Marshal. However, Moreau, who was almost as talented probably as any of the marshals, Napoleon just couldn't get over his constant scheming and plotting against him. So he ultimately exiled him and didn't make him a marshal. So I don't know which category Kleber would have fallen into.
Yeah, or Kleber could have retired maybe permanently this time. And then he's appointed an honorary marshal after the fact, because Napoleon, there's a number of older generals that were out of the service. They're still appointed marshals
Yep.
as a sign of respect, and he could have been one of those, because by this point, Kleber is getting older.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much campaigning he would have left in him.
Yeah, and you do want to credit like the awful situation Napoleon left him in. Now, Napoleon, he did receive letters, or letters were sent requesting him to return to France. Now, he didn't get those because of the British blockade, but he probably for Napoleon's career, it was the right move to go back to France and become first consul and all that. So I think Kleber did as well as he could in the situation Napoleon left him in.
Oh, 100%. I mean, ultimately, he's left in that situation. He keeps the army together. And he wins a pretty significant battle. Ultimately, I don't think he's successful in the long run if he's forced to stay there. But Napoleon himself, right? He had failures in Egypt and in the Syrian campaign, let alone in this situation. So I definitely think Kleber did the best he possibly could, given the circumstances.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Michael, thank you for that biography. That was very impressive. I learned a lot about Kleber and his background, especially his early years. So I really appreciate that. And we thank you for coming on the show.
No, I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we'll have you back on soon. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.